The evening of October 14th, 1066. The battlefield at Hastings lies strewn with the bodies of England's warriors. Among them, the fallen King Harold Godwinson, the last crowned Anglo-Saxon king. Duke William of Normandy's banner flies victorious. Is this the end of Anglo-Saxon England? Not immediately. In fact, the conquest was far from complete. The dramatic clash at Hastings was only the beginning of a tumultuous endgame. In the months and years that followed, Anglo-Saxon England faded not in an instant, but through fire and famine, resistance and ruthless repression. Contemporary chroniclers capture this transition in vivid detail. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by English monks, tells of how King William imposed heavy tax on the wretched people, and yet let his men always plunder the country that they went over. On the other side, Norman writers like William of Poitiers celebrated Duke William's triumph as divinely ordained and justified. Between these perspectives, we have a complex story that emerges, one of a conquered nation's last stand and a conqueror's iron resolve. So let's go together today to those final days of Anglo-Saxon England, focusing on the aftermath of the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and the ensuing decline of Anglo-Saxon rule under Norman occupation. We're mainly going to look into the insurgencies and resistance movements that flared up against William's new regime, from desperate last stands in the fens and forests to rebellions of the great cities of the north. Our journey is going to draw on primary and near contemporary sources, the plaintive entries of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the more biased in the Norman direction account of William of Poitiers, the later reflections of Orderic Vitalis, and the stark evidence of the Domesday Book. Through all these sources, we're going to uncover vivid anecdotes and a lot of the lesser-known details. A queen mother begging for her son's body, a rebel noble who turned into a folk hero, entire regions laid waste in punitive devastation, and even a defiant Englishman refuted to have taunted the Norman besiegers by dropping his pants and mooning them from the city walls. By the end of our time together today, you'll understand how Anglo-Saxon England met its demise, not in a single decisive stroke at Hastings, but in a brutal tapestry of events following over decades. It is a story of courage and tragedy, resistance and ruthlessness, and provides a window into how the medieval world recorded and remembered a people's last stand for their way of life. So with that being said, let's begin in the weeks after Hastings, when William of Normandy moved to make himself a master of a hostile land. But where are my manners? Shouldn't I say hello and welcome everyone to the channel? It's probably a good idea, isn't it? Well, welcome to the channel then. Well, I hope you enjoyed the introduction. I'd like to say hello to any newcomers and invite you to click the subscribe button, the like button, and leave a comment. It certainly helps the algorithm push the video out to more people. And thank you so much to all of the patrons, YouTube members, and those who checked out the merch store. There is a reason why the videos are ad-free, and it is due to the generous support on those platforms. So thank you very much. Now, all of that out of the way, let's get started. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Hastings, Duke William expected the remaining English leadership to capitulate. Yet in London, the heart of Anglo-Saxon power, there was a brief attempt to preserve native rule. The Witan, the Council of Nobles and Clergy, selected young Edgar the Ætheling, the last surviving male claimant of the royal house of Wessex, as king. Edgar was but a teenager, and had a tenuous claim at best, crowned only by the desperate hope of rallying resistance. This election of sorts of Edgar never resulted in an actual coronation, but it was a token of defiance rather than a practical transfer of power. Contemporary Norman chroniclers note that support for Edgar was half-hearted. In reality, with Harold's brothers and many earls slain at Hastings, the English leadership was in disarray. William, for his part, did not march immediately on London from Hastings. Cautious on further traps, he advanced in a circuitous route through the southeast, burning and harrying towns in Kent and along the Thames Valley as he went. One Norman source describes how William's forces clashed with English fighters at Southwark, just across the Thames from London. A sharp skirmish that left Southwark in flames and convinced the Londoners that resistance was futile. By early December of 1066, William reached Berkhamsted in Hertfordshire. Here, the inevitable occurred. Edgar the Ætheling, along with Archbishop Ealdred of York, Archbishop Stigand of Canterbury, and the remaining English nobles, including Earls Edwin and Morcar, met William and offered him the submission of the city, and with that, the crown. They swore oaths of fealty and gave hostages, effectively acknowledging William as king. This submission at Berkhamsted marked the formal capitulation of the Anglo-Saxon political elite. And so on Christmas Day, 1066, Duke William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The coronation itself became a symbol of the uneasy melding of the Norman and English together. According to Orderic Vitalis, a monk born a few years after the conquest, the ceremony descended into chaos and terror. When the assembled English Normans shouted acclamations of "God save the King" in their tongues, the Norman guards stationed outside the abbey misunderstood the noise as a riot. Panicking, the guards set fire to nearby buildings and charged about, causing smoke and commotion to fill the air. Inside the abbey, the congregation, just moments ago rejoicing, fell into confusion as the flames spread. Many attendees fled, leaving the new king almost alone at the altar. But despite all the bedlam, Archbishop Ealdred managed to complete the rites and place the crown on William's head. It was a grimly pretentious start to Norman rule, to say the least. The crowning of William the Conqueror, literally accompanied by fear and fire. But in the months immediately after his coronation, King William tried to consolidate his hold on the kingdom. Work was yet to be done. He seized the royal treasury at Winchester and began distributing high offices to his Norman followers. But he also showed a degree of conciliatory pragmatism at first. Several English nobles who submitted were allowed to keep their titles or lands temporarily. For example, Edwin and Morcar, the young Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, were initially treated with honour and confirmed in their earldoms, though under Norman supervision. Another prominent English lord, Waltheof of Northumbria, son of Earl Seward, also swore loyalty. William even married Waltheof to his own niece Judith, an apparent gesture of integration. These moves indicate William's awareness that he ruled a heavily armed and restive foreign land. He needed to secure loyalty where possible, and avoid driving all English nobility into rebellion at once. Nonetheless, resentment smouldered. The heavy geld, or tax, levied in early 1067, noted by the Chronicle, and the billeting of Norman troops on the populace, bred more than a little bit of anger. William soon departed England in spring of 1067 to return to Normandy and celebrate his victory, taking with him English hostages and treasure. In his absence, he left two of his most trusted men, his half-brother Odo of Bayeux and Lord William Fitzosborne, as regents now in charge of England. Their rule proved harsh and tactless, stirring the first embers of English resistance. In fact, it was under their watch, and with the king overseas, that the first rebellions against Norman rule erupted. And so the initial English resistance to Norman rule flared up almost immediately after 1067 and continued into 1068, particularly in the western shires. One notable early rebel was Eadric the Wild, also called the Forester or Silvaticus, a thane from the Welsh border region. Eadric refused to submit to Norman authority and formed an alliance with Welsh princes, capitalizing on the traditional Welsh-English camaraderie against outside invaders. Later chronicles recount that Eadric and his Welsh allies launched guerrilla-style attacks on Norman positions. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions cryptically that, quote, "The child, Eadric, and the Britons were unsettled, and fought with the castlemen at Hereford, and did them much harm." Now, what is this term, castlemen? The term itself is quite telling, actually. It refers to the Norman garrison installed in a castle at Hereford. Castles were, at this time, a new and hated imposition in the landscape of England. These wooden motte and bailey fortresses sprang up as symbols of Norman domination, a physical manifestation of the new rulers. Nobody likes that, don't they? And so Eadric's 1067 rising showed that not all English nobles had bowed at Berkhamsted. Some, especially on the fringes of the kingdom, were prepared to fight on. At the same time, in 1067, discontent in Kent led to another dramatic episode. Count Eustace of Boulogne, who ironically had fought alongside William at Hastings, turned against him. Eustace attempted an attack on Dover Castle, possibly hoping to stir an English revolt in the southeast. The assault failed. Dover's Norman garrison repelled Eustace's force, but it showed the instability of William's new realm. Even Norman allies could become adversaries if they sensed weakness or opportunity. But the most serious early rebellion coalesced in the south-west of England, centered on the city of Exeter. You see, Exeter had become a refuge for the remnants of Godwinson's family. After Hastings, King Harold's mother, the formidable Gytha Thorkeldsdottir, excuse me, that's a bit of a difficult name. Well, he retreated to Exeter with a cache of treasure and loyal huscarls. She, along with other surviving English nobles in the west, spurred a local resistance. When William's regents demanded Exeter's submission and an oath of fealty, the city outright refused. According to Orderic Vitalis, the men of Exeter defiantly replied, that they would, quote, not admit the Norman king, nor pay him a penny more than they had to the previous king. Of course, an open challenge like that had to be met directly. King William, back in England by December 1067, reacted swiftly to Exeter's revolt. In 1068, he marched a royal army westward in a harsh winter campaign, a testament to his determination to crush dissent before it spread, as usually winter was not the time to be doing this sort of thing. So as he advanced, William took brutal measures to cow the populace. The chroniclers recount that upon reaching the outskirts of Exeter, William captured a group of hostages, possibly the relatives of rebel leaders. In full view of Exeter's walls, he had one hostage blinded, his eyes ripped out. Pretty horrifying warning. Rather than intimidating the townsfolk into surrender, however, this just made them extremely angry, the cruelty seemingly stealing their resolve. The Chronicle notes that Exeter's citizens withstood William for 18 days. William laid siege to Exeter, attempting to storm its formidable Roman-built walls. Medieval sources describe a grim episode during the siege. William of Malmesbury claims that one indomitable defender atop the walls dropped his dax and mooned the Normans, bearing his buttocks and even breaking wind in their direction. Well, in proud defiance at all, after the blinding of the hostage. Not sure how effective it was to crush Norman morale, but I suppose it's better than nothing. Well, such an image as that, whether literal or apocryphal, captures the spirit of the English resistant in those early days. Angry, fearless, and perhaps recklessly brave. Ultimately, over 2 weeks of siege, Exeter fell. According to the Chronicle, the city surrendered only after the Thanes had betrayed them. This suggests that some local leaders lost heart or secretly negotiated with William. The Norman king was merciful in victory by his standards, at least. He did not sack Exeter wholesale. Instead, he accepted the city's capitulation, took hostages to ensure loyalty, and pardoned the townspeople, aside from presumably confiscating Geitha's treasure. Now, speaking of Geitha, Harold's mother, that is, she managed to escape Exeter before the fall. She fled, eventually making her way out of England. One colourful, near-contemporary source, a Latin poem on the conquest, Carmen d'Hastinge Proelio, written in about 1067, later recounts a dramatic anecdote involving Geitha. Purportedly, she had approached King William after Hastings and offered the weight of Harold's body in gold as a ransom for her son's corpse. The Carmen says William, infuriated, refused this plea, and instead ordered Harold's mutilated body to be buried by the seashore, on the summit of a cliff, as a guardian over the sea. Whether that's true or not, it illustrates how even in defeat the Godwinsons tried to salvage their dignity, and how unsparing William could be to the memory of his foes. Either way, Exeter was subdued, and William wasted no time fortifying his grip. If he was on a roll, he was not going to stop. He installed a Norman sheriff and garrison in Exeter, and immediately began the construction of a castle within the city to deter future rebellion. This became a pattern. Wherever resistance was crushed, a castle rose in its place, a stern reminder of Norman authority. Yet the unrest did not start and end at Exeter. Harold's illegitimate sons, who had fled to Ireland after their father's death, launched 2 invasion attempts to stoke the fires of resistance. In mid-1068, Harold's sons, possibly Godwine, Edmund, and Magnus, landed with Irish mercenaries on the coast of Devon. The Chronicle records that they, quote, came from Ireland with a naval force into the mouth of the Avon, that is the Avon River it's referring to, and ravaged the area around central Bristol. Through an attempted assault on Bristol itself, was repelled by the townsfolk. An English royal official, Eadnoth the Steward, a former servant of King Edward and King Harold, led loyalist forces against the invaders. In the ensuing fight, Eadnoth was killed and the skirmish was quite bloody, but ultimately the raiders retreated to their ships. Harold's sons tried again in 1069, landing in Cornwall or Somerset with a fleet of 64 ships. This time, they were met and decisively defeated by Earl Brian of Brittany, a Norman allied lord near the River Tor. Many of their warriors were slain, and the surviving brothers fled back to Ireland, empty-handed and quite disappointed, one can imagine. These braved but doomed forays by Harold's progeny added a romantic coda of sorts to the Anglo-Saxon resistance. The sons of the fallen king, lighting up that flame of revolt, only to see it snuffed out on the shores of the homeland they sought so boldly to reclaim. By the end of 1068, William had largely pacified southern and central England. He had dealt with unrest in the west, and had either co-opted or neutralized most of the Anglo-Saxon nobility in these regions. Yet the north of England remained a thorn in his side. The Northumbrians, they had their own proud traditions and their own grievances, and they were about to ignite the most serious rebellion of all, one that would push King William to the harshest of responses. Northumbria, with its centre at the city of York, it had never been easily governed from the south. Even under Anglo-Saxon kings, northern England was semi-autonomous. After the conquest, William faced a volatile mix in Northumbria. The native Northumbrians resented the outsiders, and several exiled English leaders sought to use the north as a springboard for resistance. Early in 1067, William had appointed Copsig, a loyal Northumbrian, as Earl there, but Copsig was soon killed by northern rebels. In 1068, William tried again by naming a Norman, Robert de Comines, as Earl of Northumbria, but this proved to be quite disastrous. In January 1069, before Robert could even secure his rule, he and his retinue were ambushed in Durham and slaughtered by Northumbrian insurgents. The North had effectively risen in revolt, killing the chosen governor of the king. Sensing a looming crisis, Edgar the Ætheling, the same Edgar who had submitted in 1066, escaped from William's court and headed north. Edgar had taken refuge in Scotland for a time, at the court of King Mael Colum, that is Malcolm III, who had married Edgar's sister Margaret. But now Edgar saw an opportunity. He joined forces with the Northumbrian lords, including Earl Gospatric, a local magnate whom William had briefly installed, then exiled, and Earl Waltheof, who despite his earlier submission was hovering between loyalty and rebellion. Together, they prepared to make a stand. In the late summer of 1069, a grand alliance formed against the Normans. Edgar Ætheling and the English rebels in Northumbria were bolstered by an invading army of Danes. King Sweyn of Denmark, a formidable figure, related by blood to King Canute, dispatched a fleet. Some sources say as many 240 ships under the command of his brothers and sons, including Earls Thorkill and Osborne. These Danish forces sailed up the Humber estuary in September of 1069 and linked up with Edgar's northern English host. The presence of the Danes was a game-changer, to say the least. Many common folk in the Danelaw, that is the old Viking-settled regions of the north, welcomed them with open arms, seeing Sweyn's house as potential liberators from Norman rule. In a celebratory mood, the Chronicle says they were riding and marching full merrily with an immense army. The combined forces of the Danes and the English marched on York, the chief city of the north. What followed was the greatest single military disaster for the Normans in the entire conquest period. The rebels attacked York and overwhelmed the two castles that William's men had built there the year before. The Chronicle reports that they stormed and demolished the castle and won innumerable treasures therein, slew there many hundreds of Frenchmen, that is, the Normans, and led away many to the ships. York's fall was a tremendous psychological and strategic blow. One of the Norman commanders in York, William Mallet, barely escaped with his life. The victors, however, did not or could not hold the city for long. In the chaos, a terrible collateral tragedy occurred. The retreating Normans set fire to parts of York, and in the process, York Minster, the great cathedral of St. Peter, was plundered and burned. The conflagration likely started as Norman forces torched buildings to cover or loot to the rebels. But it resulted in the destruction of one of England's holiest sites. Thus, even in victory, the North paid a bitter price for it. When news of York's fall and the slaughter of its garrison reached King William, his reaction was as ferocious as it was swift. Burning with anger, he vowed to annihilate the rebellion. William raced north with an army, with all the force that he could collect. In the words of the Chronicle, that is, arriving before the Danes and English could consolidate. But the rebel forces wisely avoided direct pitched battle with William. Indeed, the Danes soon slipped away to the east coast, more interested in plunder than in risking a decisive fight. Edgar Ætheling fled back to Scotland once York became untenable. Frustrated, but determined to make an example, William unleashed what has become known to history as the harrying of the North. The harrying of the North, 1069 to 1070, stands as one of the most infamous acts of brutal repression in medieval history. Primary sources, especially Orderic Vitalis, writing a generation later, condemn it in the harshest of terms. William, finding no army left to fight, decided to punish the entire region for harboring rebellion. He divided his forces and systematically laid waste to Yorkshire and the surrounding shires. Villages were torched, crops and livestock destroyed. Supplies were burned or seized. The aim was to render the north uninhabitable, starving out any remaining resistance and deterring future revolts. Orderic Vitalis gives a searing account. Quote, William made no effort to restrain his fury and punished the innocent with the guilty. In his anger, he commanded that all crops, herds, and food of every kind be gathered and burned to ashes, so that the whole region of the north of the Humber would be deprived of any sustenance. Contemporary estimates of the scale of the destruction vary, but they are uniformly grim. Orderic claims that more than 100,000 people perished of hunger, men, women, and children alike, starved as a man-made famine ravaged the land. The same chronicler somberly notes, "My writings have often praised William, but for this act I can only condemn him," showing that even Norman-leaning observers were understandably appalled. There are even accounts of cannibalism in the wake of the harrying, desperate survivors resorting to eating human flesh amid the utter scarcity. While such details are difficult to verify, they speak to the collective memory of how terrible the devastation was. Orderic Vitalis, who was drawing on older sources and perhaps local stories, mentions that the famine was so severe that some people, quote, fed on the bodies of those who had died. A horrifying image. Whether literal or exaggerated, it conveys the depth of the suffering. The physical and economic scars of the harrying were deep. Even many years later, when William ordered the Great Survey of the Kingdom in 1086, that is the Domesday Book, large swaths of Yorkshire and northern England were still recorded as waste, having never fully recovered. Domesday records village after village in the north with either drastically reduced populations or no taxable value at all, a direct consequence of the deliberate destruction. Historians estimate that in Yorkshire, as much as 75% of the population either died or fled as a result of William's vengeance. Only about a quarter of the region's pre-conquest population and plough teams remained by 1086. The land lay waste, a silent testimony in the Domesday Book to the atrocities of 1069 and 70. One entry famously lists vast stretches as vasta, or wasted. Modern analysis supports the chronicle too. One scholarly assessment notes that some 150,000 fewer people and 80,000 fewer oxen were in Yorkshire by 1086 compared to 1066. Arguably, scorched earth warfare of unprecedented scale, for the first time recorded in Western Europe's early Middle Ages. By early 1070, the Danish king Sweyn, seeing William's resolve and negotiating shrewdly, accepted payment to withdraw his fleet. The Danes sailed home with loot after a side trek to plunder the Abbey of Peterborough, aided by local rebels. More on that soon. William thus rid himself of the Danish threat through bribery and diplomacy, even as his armies terrorized the land. The rebellion in the north was effectively broken. Its chief leaders were dead, hiding, or in exile. Edgar Ætheling, the figurehead of the resistance, returned to Scotland once more, thwarted and empty-handed. He would eventually seek reconciliation with William a few years later, finally accepting a comfortable exile or vassalage. Now it's worth noting that Norman chroniclers later depicted William as remorseful for the harrying, at least in his final years. Orderic Vitalis recounts a scene of William on his deathbed in 1087, allegedly confessing, "I caused the death of thousands by starvation and war, especially in Yorkshire. In a mad fury I descended on the English of the north like a raging lion. I chastised a great multitude of men and women with the lash of starvation, and alas, was the cruel murderer of many thousands, both young and old." Whether or not William truly expressed such regret, the inclusion of this speech in Orderic's Historia Ecclesiastica shows how notorious the devastation was. Even if the king had secured his throne, the moral cost of the conquest was certainly never forgotten by those who chronicled it. But even as the north was being laid waste, rebellion flickered on in other quarters. The year 1070 saw resistance coalesce in the eastern Fenlands, the marshy, mist-laden wilderness of the Isle of Ely in Cambridgeshire. This resistance became legendary thanks to one name, Hereward the Wake, a Lincolnshire nobleman's son, possibly exiled before the conquest, who returned to lead insurgents against the Normans. In later folklore, he would be iconized as a proto-Robin Hood figure, the Wake meaning the watchful. Contemporary evidence for Hereward is slim but significant. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle refers to Hereward and his gang of outlaws operating there in the Fenlands. Other sources, including Orderic and the later romantic Gesta Herewardi, fill in a few of the details. Hereward had a grudge against the Normans that seized his family's lands, and he was brave, cunning, skilled in guerrilla warfare. The spark for the Fenland rebellion was the arrival of the Danes in 1070. Although King Sweyn soon negotiated to leave England, a part of his forces lingered in the fens under Sweyn's own brother, Jarl Asbjorn. They set up camp at Ely, which was a secure island amid the marshes. English fugitives from the north and elsewhere flocked to Ely, seeing it as the last stronghold of English liberty. Among them was Morcar, the former Earl of Northumbria, the brother of Edwin. Morcar had finally lost William's trust and left court to join the rebels. Even Bishop Ætheling of Durham came south with treasure, hoping to keep them from Norman hands. Hereward emerged as a leader of this motley band of guerrilla fighters. One of the most dramatic episodes of this rebellion was the raid on Peterborough Abbey in 1070. The Chronicle gives a startling account. Hearing that King William had appointed a Norman abbot, the fearsome Turold, to Peterborough, Hereward and the Danes preemptively attacked the abbey to seize its riches, ostensibly to keep them out of Norman hands. The monks of Peterborough, torn between loyalty to their king and their countrymen, were unable to resist. Hereward's men plundered the monastery of vast treasure. Quote from the Chronicle, "They seized there so much gold and silver, as no man could tell another." The Chronicle then lists golden shrines, crucifixes, holy relics, all stripped away. They claimed, perhaps disingenuously, to do it out of attachment to the minster, implying that they preferred to send the wealth to Denmark rather than let the Normans have it. Indeed, the loot was carried off to Ely, and shortly thereafter put on Danish ships. King William and King Sweyn reached a peace accord, after which the Danes sailed off with the treasure. Fate was, however, not kind to the stolen riches. A storm scattered the Danish fleet, and much of the treasure was lost at sea, or consumed in a fire after reaching Denmark. This quasi-piratical adventure at Peterborough was a blow to the Normans' regime prestige. A famous abbey looted right under their noses, and added to Hereward's renown as a daring rebel. It shows how even the sacred was not spared in this age of upheaval. Whether Norman or English, each side violated churches in the struggle, either by plundering or by punitive burning, such as what we saw in York Minster. By late 1070, King William realized that the Isle of Ely became the last pocket of organized English resistance. In 1071, he decisively moved to eliminate it. The king ordered a combined land and naval operation to encircle the marsh. Norman warships sailed into the fens, while on land, William's forces constructed a remarkable engineering work, a causeway, or pontoon bridge across the bogs leading to Ely. This feat allowed heavy troops to approach the rebel camp, previously accessible only by boat or secret paths. Even here, legend creeps in. Later tales claim that the Normans brought a sorceress or witch to the front lines, setting her atop a wooden tower to curse the rebels, only to have Hereward and his men set the tower ablaze, casting the witch to a fiery death. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, however, doesn't really mention witches, but it does state plainly that William, quote, beset the land all about, wrought a bridge, and went in. Surrounded and outnumbered, the English resistance at Ely collapsed. Earl Morcar, Bishop Ætheling, and many others surrendered to the king's mercy. William's vengeance was unforgiving. Morcar spent the rest of his life as a prisoner. Bishop Ætheling was imprisoned and died in captivity, and other lesser rebels had their eyes ripped out and were thrown into dungeons. This marked the effective end of the last English-led insurrection. Yet one figure was not captured. Hereward himself escaped. The Chronicle notes, with uncharacteristic drama, that all the others surrendered, except Hereward alone, and those who would go with him, and he had led them out wonderfully and with great daring. Hereward vanishes into the wilderness, eluding the Normans. Later stories say he eventually made peace with William and was allowed to live quietly, or alternatively that he was betrayed and killed. The sources vary on that. But in folklore of the conquered English, Hereward lives on as a symbol of defiance, the last English hero, holding out in those marshes when all others had fallen. Orderic Vitalis, writing decades later, praised Hereward's prowess, and medieval ballads would embellish his exploits. The fact that the Chronicle, typically terse, bothered to single out Hereward's escape triumphantly suggests his impact had quite a lot on the English imagination even at the time. But either way, with Ely subdued in 1071, William the Conqueror had extinguished the final embers of large-scale Anglo-Saxon revolt. The following year, 1072, he marched north to Scotland and forced King Malcolm III to swear allegiance and hand over Edgar Ætheling, ensuring no more northern refuge for the English claimants. Edgar himself submitted to William in 1074 and was integrated into the king's court. He would later leave for adventures abroad, even joining the First Crusade, far away from the kingdom he once sought to rule. The English resistance, in any organized form, was over. But, ironically, one of the last rebellions against William's rule was not led by Anglo-Saxons at all, but by William's own earls, in which the last surviving English earl became tragically entangled. In 1075, England saw one more rebellion, a conspiracy among Norman nobles that has come to be known as the Revolt of the Earls. Two young Norman lords, Earl Ralph de Gale of Norfolk and Earl Roger de Breteuil of Hereford, plotted to overthrow or divide the kingdom, apparently feeling William's rule was too heavy-handed even for them. Ralph and Roger had personal motives, though. William had recently curbed their powers, but they also enlisted the help of disaffected groups, including the Bretons, and even the Danes once more. What makes this revolt particularly poignant in the context of Anglo-Saxon England's end is the involvement and fate of Earl Waltheof of Northumbria, the last Englishman to hold an earl's title under William. Waltheof, the son of Earl Seward, had an interesting career during the conquest. He submitted in 1066, was shown favour by William, and even helped suppress the Northern Rebellion of 1069. At one point, Waltheof famously stood in York's gateway, chopping down Normans with an axe as they fled the burning castle. only to kneel to William later and be pardoned. By 1072, William had made Waltheof Earl of Northumberland again, hoping to use a native noble to keep the northerners in line. But by 1075, Waltheof's loyalties were conflicted. According to Orderic Vitalis, Waltheof was invited to a lavish wedding feast in Norwich. Earl Ralph was marrying a relative of William's, and Earl Roger attended as well. There, in an atmosphere of revelry, the Chronicle darkly calls it the bride ale, source of man's bale, in a burst of rhyme, the Earls hatched their plot to drive the king out of the realm. They allegedly appealed to Waltheof to join. Perhaps in a moment of weakness or drunken bravado, Waltheof consented to the conspiracy. Or perhaps he only pretended to, intending to betray it later. Sources differ. Some say Waltheof lost his nerve and actually revealed the plot to William, hoping to earn forgiveness. Others say he was genuinely complicit at first. Regardless, the revolt of the Earls unravelled quite quickly. Before the rebels could coordinate, William's regents and loyalists in England acted. Earl Roger's mustering of forces in the west was checked by other nobles. Earl Ralph raised his banner in Norwich, but Norman garrisons and local English feared troops who notably did not rise for these Norman rebels, hemmed him in. Ralph fled overseas, and his new bride heroically defended Norwich Castle for a short time before negotiating safe passage to Brittany. A Danish fleet under Prince Canute, son of King Sweyn, arrived off England's east coast belatedly with 200 ships, but finding the rebellion fizzled, the Danes did little beyond just plundering York once again. You don't want to waste a trip, don't you? Seizing what treasures remained in the ruins of St. Peter's, and then sailed back home. King William returned from Normandy, furious at the betrayal of his magnates. Roger de Brotuil was captured and imprisoned for life. Ralph de Gale remained in revolt in Brittany, so William contented himself with banishing of all Ralph's followers and punishing their families. As for Waltheof, the sole English participant, his fate was the cruelest. Initially, William wanted to spare him. He travelled to Normandy and seemingly secured a pardon by throwing himself at the king's mercy, even offering a hefty ransom. But the trust was gone. In 1075, Waltheof was brought back to England in chains. Despite being an earl by William's own grant and a son-in-law of the king's, Waltheof was made an example of. In May 1076, Waltheof was executed by beheading on St. Giles Hill outside Winchester. He died praying and begging forgiveness. This execution of an English noble, the last English earl nonetheless, by the Norman king, sent a chilling message. Even the highest-born Englishman was not safe under Norman rule if disloyal. The people's reaction to Waltheof's death showed where their sympathies lay. The Chronicle reports his body was buried at Crowland Abbey, and soon rumours of miracles at his tomb began to circulate. Orderic Vitalis notes that the English lamented Waltheof as a martyr and, quote, one of the greatest of the English. And indeed, by the 12th century, a cult had formed around his memory. In the folk mind, Waltheof, flawed though he was, became a symbol of the noble Englishman destroyed by the foreign oppressor, perhaps even a saintly figure who paid for the sins of his age. Thus, ironically, the rebellion of 1075, though led by Normans, underscored the final eclipse of Anglo-Saxon nobility. After Waltheof's execution, no English earl remained in William's realm. Virtually all the great landholders were Normans, Frenchmen, or other continental allies of the Conqueror. After 1075, Anglo-Saxon England as a political entity was irrevocably gone. King William cemented his power in the decades that followed through a combination of feudal reorganization, military fortification, and administrative innovation. Castles now studded the land. From peasant hovels one could often see the tower of a Norman keep on the horizon, whether it be the massive stone fortress at the Tower of London, or the motte and bailey strongholds in every shire. These were garrisoned by foreign troops, and symbolized that the old order was well and truly supplanted. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was almost entirely supplanted by the Normans too. A glance at the Domesday Book of 1086, essentially a grand inventory of all landholders, tells the story quite plainly. By that year, hundreds of Anglo-Saxon thanes had been dispossessed, their lands given to about 200 Norman barons. It is estimated that all of the lands in England, over 95%, were under Norman control by 1086. The Domesday Survey lists only a handful of English names as significant landowners. An oft-cited statistic is that only 2 of the great landowners in 1086 were Englishmen of any note. One chronicle wryly notes that England has plainly been made Norman. The high offices of the kingdom, earldoms, bishoprics, abbacies, were almost all held by Normans too. William had replaced the Anglo-Saxon bishops with Normans. For instance, in 1070, Archbishop Stigand of Canterbury was deposed, and Lanfranc, an Italian Norman reformer, took the seat. The ancient English monasteries now saw Norman abbots installed. In every village, the English peasants now answered to a Norman lord in a castle or manor. The social and legal framework also changed swiftly. The chronicle entry for 1070 bitterly observes that William ordered all the monasteries in England to be plundered, perhaps an allusion to the royal sequestration of the church treasures or the purging of the Anglo-Saxon church leaders. The English language itself was eclipsed in officialdom by Latin and Norman French. Yet even amid the transformation, the memory of the final struggle persisted among the common people. Stories of heroic resistors like Hereward were told by bards. Tales of Norman cruelty, such as the harrying, were recounted with horror. Anglo-Saxon England died, but it was not forgotten, not by those who had lived through its agonizing end. William the Conqueror spent the rest of his reign, until 1087, dealing with the occasional revolts on the continent and organizing his Anglo-Norman realm. England under William became one of the most tightly governed kingdoms in Europe, largely as a response to the rebellions he faced. The Domesday Book of 1086 was in part a product of that need for control. A meticulous accounting to ensure every hide of land was under royal vigilance. Interestingly, Domesday also inadvertently recorded the aftermath of the conquest. Many entries in Yorkshire simply state waste, as we've mentioned, a direct echo of the harrying. In a way, Domesday is the final ledger of Anglo-Saxon England. Kind of like a eulogy. It tallies what was left, who held it, and how the balance had shifted entirely to the Normans. It stands as the Conqueror's final imprimatur on the land he had won and pacified. By the time of William's death, Anglo-Saxon England's ruling class had been almost entirely replaced. A French-speaking monarch and nobility now lorded over an English-speaking populace. The insurgencies and resistances that flared after 1066 were ultimately futile, but they were not meaningless. They forced William to adjust his approach, to build castles, to garrison the country thoroughly, and to rule with an iron fist. They also ensured that the transition from Norman rule was anything but smooth. The English did not give up their kingdom without a fight at every corner, whether led by a noble, outlaw, or simple townsfolk refusing a conqueror entry. So in the broader view of history, one might ask, when did Anglo-Saxon England truly end? Was it the moment King Harold fell, an arrow pierced and slain by swords on Hastings field? Or was it when the last English Earl, Waltheof, knelt before the headsman's axe? Perhaps it ended when Hereward slipped away into the greenwood, leaving the Normans to rule an empty battlefield. Symbolically, one could say Anglo-Saxon England ended when its chronicles fell silent. Indeed, by the 1080s, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's entries grow sparse and increasingly penned by Norman hands. Yet even silence can speak volumes. One of the final chronicle entries in the Peterborough manuscript laments in Old English that peasants perished of hunger and had to eat horse flesh in the harrying years, and that how many thousands were destroyed, no one can say. A mournful epitaph for a destroyed world. In the end, the Norman conquest was complete. Anglo-Saxon England's political structures were dismantled and rebuilt in Norman fashion. But through the insurgencies and suffering of those final days, Anglo-Saxon England also bequeathed something to posterity, a narrative of resistance, the story of a subjugated people resisting a conqueror. In the sources we cited, the Chronicles' year-by-year grief, the Norman Chronicles' mix of admiration and revulsion, the Domesday Book's cold columns of data, we find the pieces of that story. And when we piece them together, we preserve the memory of those tumultuous final days. We ensure that King Harold's blood on the soil of Sussex, the charred ruins of Yorkshire's village, and the rebel holdouts in the misty fens are not forgotten as mere footnotes, but recognized, well and truly, as the last chapter of Anglo-Saxon England, one that was written in courage and blood. Well, thank you very much for listening. Interesting story, isn't it? I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons, supporters, Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfred, Near, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro, Nerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dalbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, and Nephthys. Thank you so much. And if you want to support the channel, well, that would make me quite happy if you did, obviously. Well, the best way you can support is just go and watch another video, I suppose. One of my videos, though. Not somebody else's. Okay, everybody. That's enough for tonight from me. I wish you all the best. Lots of love to you all over the world. And good night.